Kurt Meyer's trajectory cannot be understood without placing him within the broader geopolitical and ideological upheavals that defined Europe in the aftermath of the First World War. Born in 1910 in Yerxheim, a town in the Duchy of Brunswick, Meyer's formative years unfolded against a backdrop of national humiliation, economic hardship, and political fragmentation in Weimar Germany. Like many young Germans of his generation, Meyer grew up amid the echoes of Versailles, a treaty that not only dismantled Germany's military prowess, but also fostered deep resentment among veterans and the new generation alike. The disbandment of the Imperial Army, the restriction of the Reichswehr to 100,000 men, and the perceived betrayal by Germany's civilian leaders cultivated an environment ripe for radicalization. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, German society was teetering between competing ideologies. The collapse of democratic institutions, the instability of coalition governments, and the hyperinflation crisis of 1923 paved the way for extremist movements. The Nazi Party, capitalizing on this instability, presented itself as the only viable force capable of restoring national pride, economic stability, and military strength. Within this context, young men like Meyer were drawn to the militarized culture promoted by the Nazis, particularly the elite Schutzstaffel, SS. For those with ambition and martial discipline, the SS represented not merely a political instrument, but an alternate pathway to prestige and command in the new Reich. Meyer joined the Nazi Party and the SS in the early 1930s, at a time when both institutions were rapidly evolving from fringe organizations into dominant instruments of state control. The SS, originally formed as Hitler's personal guard, was undergoing transformation into a paramilitary force with specialized units such as the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, LSSAH. Meyer was recruited into this elite formation, which would later evolve into a frontline combat division. His early training and indoctrination coincided with Heinrich Himmler's effort to cultivate a warrior caste, one that fused ideological purity with ruthless efficiency. Meanwhile, the broader geopolitical landscape of Europe was shifting rapidly. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933 marked the beginning of open rearmament in violation of the Versailles Treaty. By the time Meyer had begun his formal military training, Germany was already investing heavily in mechanization, armored warfare, and air superiority. The rapid modernization of the Wehrmacht and the SS's parallel development into a military force, the Waffen SS, provided Meyer with opportunities that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. His background as a trained officer and his early political loyalty placed him in a position to benefit from the rapid promotions offered within the expanding SS hierarchy. As tensions escalated in Europe, with Germany's annexation of Austria, Anschluss, in 1938, and the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939, Meyer's unit was mobilized in anticipation of full-scale war. Public sentiment in Germany had shifted decisively in favor of aggressive expansion, bolstered by propaganda that portrayed Germany as the victim of Allied encirclement and Bolshevik threat. Meyer, like many in the SS, viewed the coming conflict not merely in strategic terms, but as a civilizational struggle against inferior races and ideologies. This belief system would define not only his actions in combat, but also his methods of occupation and repression. By the time the Wehrmacht invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering the Second World War, Meyer was a company commander within the LSSAH. His performance in the campaign, characterized by rapid advances and brutal efficiency, earned him early recognition. Yet the invasion also revealed the SS's role in systemic atrocities, including the targeting of civilians, political opponents, and prisoners. While regular army units often adhered to conventional rules of war, Waffen SS commanders like Meyer operated under looser constraints, both empowered and expected to implement Nazi racial policy on the battlefield. This blurring of military and ideological objectives would follow Meyer through his entire career. Even as Germany secured early victories, the seeds of future conflict and accountability were being sown. The international community, particularly Britain and France, viewed Germany's aggression with growing alarm. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, initially a co-belligerent via the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, remained a looming strategic adversary. Within this environment of calculated expansion and mounting opposition, Figures like Meyer gained prominence not simply through battlefield tactics, but through their symbolic function as agents of Nazi will. He was no longer merely a commander. He was a projection of Nazi martial ideals, forged in the crucible of ideological war. By 1940, as Germany turned its attention westward, Meyer and the Waffen SS would be called upon again, this time against the professional armies of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The next phase of his career would not only test his tactical acumen, but place him at the center of debates that still define the Waffen SS. Were they soldiers, war criminals, or both? The invasion of France and the Low Countries in May 1940 marked the first major Western campaign in which Kurt Meyer distinguished himself as a field commander. Attached to the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, LSSAH, which was still transitioning from a bodyguard regiment to a mechanized infantry unit, Meyer led reconnaissance and armored elements during the rapid German advance through Belgium. The broader strategic plan, known as Fall Gelb, relied on swift armored thrusts through the Ardennes to bypass the heavily fortified Maginot Line and encircle Allied forces. Meyer's command played a critical role in the spearhead operations that followed. As German panzer divisions surged across French territory, Meyer's unit was tasked with seizing key bridges, cutting off Allied retreat routes, and disrupting enemy coordination. His aggressive style of leadership became immediately evident. He often led from the front in armored cars and motorcycles, directing maneuvers under fire and pushing his men to maintain relentless pace. In several engagements, Meyer's reconnaissance troops surprised retreating Allied forces, capturing prisoners and material while maintaining momentum. These early successes cemented his reputation as a bold, mobile commander, capable of executing fast-paced combined arms tactics. Despite their tactical effectiveness, the Waffen SS units, including Meyer's LSSAH, quickly drew scrutiny for their conduct toward prisoners of war and civilians. During the campaign, the massacre of British POWs at Wormhout by other SS elements foreshadowed the broader pattern of war crimes associated with the SS. Although Meyer's involvement in such incidents during this phase is not conclusively documented, his later wartime conduct suggests a growing alignment with SS norms of reprisal and ideological warfare. Nevertheless, from a strictly military perspective, Meyer's performance in France was deemed exemplary by the SS leadership and resulted in promotions and commendations. Following the successful conclusion of the Western Campaign, the LSSAH was reorganized and expanded into a full division. Meyer's career advanced accordingly. Promoted to battalion commander, he oversaw the training and preparation of new recruits as the Waffen SS reoriented toward the next major front, the Soviet Union. In preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR, Meyer's unit was heavily mechanized and re-equipped for extended operations across vast terrain. The logistical scale of the coming campaign dwarfed previous efforts, and commanders like Meyer were expected to coordinate not only tactics, but also operational endurance under extreme conditions. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa commenced with the largest land invasion in history. Meyer and the LSSAH advanced as part of Army Group South, tasked with pushing through Ukraine toward key cities like Kiev and Dnipropetrovsk. The Soviet forces, though initially disorganized and surprised, mounted stubborn resistance. Meyer's battalion faced fierce engagements in the early weeks, encountering not only conventional Red Army troops, but also fortified positions and irregular defenders. His aggressive tactics persisted, often achieving breakthroughs by concentrating force at weak points and exploiting Soviet disarray. It was during these early operations that Meyer's leadership style fully matured. He emphasized speed, aggression, and the use of reconnaissance in force. He directed armored spearheads personally, frequently bypassing standard command chains to respond to battlefield developments. His ability to adapt quickly to chaotic conditions won him recognition and the nickname Panzer Meyer, a reference both to his armored command role and his aggressive mobility on the battlefield. This period also marked the beginning of his close association with the Panzer Grenadier concept, which would define much of his later career. However, the brutality of the Eastern Front cannot be separated from Meyer's rise. As part of the Waffen SS, His unit participated in security operations behind the lines that often included reprisals, executions, and punitive actions against civilians accused of partisan activity. The SS leadership encouraged such actions under the guise of anti-partisan warfare, and Meyer's command was not exempt. While official German military records emphasized his tactical brilliance, Soviet sources and post-war investigations would later allege his involvement in war crimes during this phase. By late 1941, as the German advance stalled near the gates of Moscow and winter set in, Meyer's unit was withdrawn from the front lines. His performance had been exemplary in military terms, and he was promoted once again, now among the rising stars of the Waffen SS officer corps. The war was far from over, but Meyer had already established a reputation for speed, initiative, and an unyielding command style that matched the ferocity of the front. The next phase of his wartime career would take him westward again, where he would rise to divisional command and become embroiled in one of the most controversial episodes of the Waffen SS in France, the aftermath of D-Day. His tactical genius would soon be overshadowed by accusations that would haunt him long after the war ended. As 1944 dawned, the war had turned decisively against Germany. On the Eastern Front, Soviet offensives were regaining territory, while in the West, Allied air superiority devastated German infrastructure. Anticipating an imminent Allied invasion of Western Europe, Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht began reinforcing the Atlantic Wall and redeploying key units to France. Among those transferred was the newly formed 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed primarily of young recruits from the Hitler Youth and commanded by seasoned SS officers. One of the most experienced among them, now SS Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer, was appointed to a senior command role within the division. Meyer was initially placed in charge of the division's reconnaissance battalion, but his influence quickly expanded. With most of the division's soldiers being only 17 or 18 years old, it fell to commanders like Meyer to shape their training and discipline. He instilled in them an aggressive ethos, placing emphasis on speed, maneuver warfare, and ideological commitment. The division was notorious even before it entered combat, seen by Allied intelligence as a fanatical force likely to offer fierce resistance. Meyer's leadership played a pivotal role in solidifying this perception, and his unit was regarded as among the most battle-ready in the Normandy sector by early 1944. Operation Overlord, the Allied landings in Normandy, began on June 6, 1944. Within days, the 12th SS Panzer Division was ordered into action near Caen, a strategic city critical to both the Allied breakout and the German defense. Meyer, now acting division commander due to the wounding of his superior, was thrust into one of the most intense combat environments of the Western Front. The German High Command expected him to stabilize the front and prevent the Allies from advancing inland. Meyer deployed his forces in a series of counterattacks, designed to disrupt the Allied beachhead and slow the British and Canadian advance. His tactics reflected his Eastern Front experience, emphasizing aggressive maneuver, rapid strikes, and localized superiority. Under his direction, the 12th SS launched numerous assaults against Canadian forces near towns such as Buren, Authie, and Abbey-Ardennes. Despite being outgunned and lacking air support, Meyer's units managed to delay the Allies significantly, though at a high cost in both personnel and material. However, this phase of Meyer's career was marked not only by tactical defense, but by actions that would later lead to criminal proceedings. During the early stages of the Normandy fighting, Meyer was implicated in the summary execution of Canadian prisoners of war. In particular, at the Abbey-Ardennes and other nearby locations, SS troops under his command were found to have executed more than 100 captured soldiers. While Meyer denied issuing direct orders for these actions, his leadership, public statements, and divisional culture contributed to an atmosphere in which such crimes were carried out without hesitation. Meyer continued to command under increasingly desperate conditions. Allied air superiority rendered German movement by day nearly impossible, while artillery and naval gunfire pounded defensive positions. Nevertheless, Meyer maintained cohesion within his battered division, personally moving between units, encouraging soldiers, and directing counter-movements. His reputation among his men grew. He was seen as a fearless, even reckless leader, often observed at the front lines in a commander's tank or on a motorcycle. Despite Meyer's efforts, the German position in Normandy deteriorated rapidly. The combined weight of Allied logistics, armor, and air support overwhelmed German defenses. The 12th SS, though tenacious, was gradually pushed back toward Falaise. By late July 1944, the division had suffered catastrophic losses and was effectively encircled during the Battle of the Falaise Pocket. Meyer attempted to lead breakout attempts, coordinating with other SS and Wehrmacht units, but the disintegration of German lines could not be stopped. His forces, once regarded as elite, were now scattered remnants fighting a desperate rearguard action. Meyer himself was captured by Belgian partisans in September 1944 after fleeing the battlefield in civilian disguise. Turned over to Allied forces, he was interrogated and later tried by Canadian military authorities for war crimes, specifically the murder of Canadian POWs in Normandy. His capture marked the end of his military command, but not of his notoriety. The coming years would see his trial become one of the most publicized legal proceedings involving a Waffen SS officer, casting a long shadow over his battlefield achievements and placing his legacy under intense scrutiny. The trial of Kurt Meyer began in December 1945, held before a Canadian military court in Aurich, Germany. It was one of the first major Allied trials of a senior Waffen SS officer and served as a test case for legal accountability regarding war crimes committed by field commanders. Meyer stood accused of responsibility for the unlawful execution of Canadian prisoners of war in Normandy, specifically the killings at Abbey Ardennes and other locations where captured soldiers had been shot in violation of the Geneva Conventions. The prosecution argued that Meyer, as divisional commander and ideological leader of his troops, bore both direct and command responsibility for these atrocities. The charges centered on three key allegations: that Meyer had ordered the execution of prisoners, that he had tacitly approved or failed to prevent such actions, and that he had failed to punish those responsible. Although no definitive written orders from Meyer to execute prisoners were recovered, witness testimonies, including from SS soldiers and Canadian survivors, provided a picture of a command environment in which such actions were tolerated, if not actively encouraged. The court examined statements made by Meyer during the fighting, including his reputed assertion that no prisoners would be taken, and reviewed the organizational culture of the 12th SS Panzer Division, known for its ideological fervor and brutal conduct. Meyer's defense argued that he neither gave nor condoned illegal orders, and that the executions had been carried out by subordinate officers acting without his knowledge or consent. His lawyers emphasized the chaos of combat, the breakdown of communications during battle, and the difficulties in maintaining strict control over dispersed units under fire. They also noted that Meyer had not been present at the actual sites of the killings and could not be held personally responsible for every action undertaken by men under his command. Nevertheless, the prosecution maintained that command responsibility extended beyond direct orders. The legal precedent under review was that a commander could be held liable if he knew, or should have known, that war crimes were being committed and failed to prevent them or punish the perpetrators. This principle, later enshrined in international law, became central to Meyer's conviction. The court found that Meyer had created an environment in which unlawful killings were not only possible but likely, given the ideological training, the inflammatory rhetoric, and the lack of disciplinary action following the atrocities. On December 28, 1945, Kurt Meyer was found guilty on several counts, including inciting his troops to deny quarter and responsibility for the murder of prisoners of war. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. The verdict sent a clear message. Even battlefield commanders, especially those of elite formations like the Waffen SS, could be held legally accountable for the conduct of their troops. It was a landmark moment in the evolution of international military justice, and the case drew significant attention in both Canada and Germany. However, the sentence was not carried out. In January 1946, the Canadian government commuted Meyer's death sentence to life imprisonment. The decision was influenced by several factors: the lack of direct evidence tying Meyer to specific orders, pressure from segments of the German population and some Allied military officials, and an evolving view on post-war reconciliation. Meyer was transferred to a prison in New Brunswick, Canada, where he served the initial years of his sentence. His case became the subject of debate, with some arguing he had been made a scapegoat while others insisted justice had been rightly served. In 1951, Meyer was transferred back to a German prison. 2 years later, in a move that provoked widespread criticism, he was released on parole after serving just under 9 years in custody. His early release was part of a broader trend in post-war West Germany, where former SS personnel were gradually reintegrated into civilian life amid the Cold War's shifting political priorities. Western powers, now focused on containing Soviet influence, became more lenient in their treatment of ex-Nazi military figures, particularly those seen as militarily capable or useful in the emerging Bundeswehr. Meyer's post-prison life was far from quiet. He became an outspoken advocate for the rehabilitation of the Waffen-SS's public image. In speeches, publications, and interviews, he argued that the Waffen-SS had been a purely military organization, distinct from the SS's criminal branches like the Totenkopfverbände or the Einsatzgruppen. He portrayed himself and his comrades as professional soldiers who had been unfairly demonized by the victors. These claims were rejected by historians and many veterans organizations, particularly in Canada, but found a receptive audience in certain circles in post-war West Germany. In 1957, Meyer published a memoir titled Grenadiere, which further fueled controversy. The book blended personal recollections with a defense of the Waffen-SS's wartime conduct. While avoiding explicit denial of war crimes, it downplayed the ideological nature of SS formations and emphasized battlefield bravery and hardship. The memoir became a popular text among veterans and revisionist groups, helping to cement Meyer's legacy within a segment of German society that sought to normalize the wartime actions of the Waffen-SS. Although officially barred from holding political office or military command, Meyer remained active in veterans associations, particularly HIAG, the lobby group formed by former Waffen-SS members to advocate for legal recognition and pensions. Through HIAG, he pushed for the full legal rehabilitation of Waffen-SS veterans, framing their exclusion from West Germany's military honor system as unjust discrimination. His activism brought him into conflict with democratic politicians, historians, and Holocaust survivors who viewed such efforts as a dangerous rewriting of history. Kurt Meyer died in 1961 at the age of 51. His funeral was attended by hundreds of former comrades, many in uniform, and featured paramilitary symbolism. His legacy remains deeply divisive, praised by some for his tactical prowess, condemned by others as a symbol of the Waffen-SS's militarized fanaticism. His story continues to raise difficult questions about command responsibility, post-war justice, and the boundaries of historical memory. The peak of Kurt Meyer's wartime career, both in terms of operational command and visibility within the Waffen-SS, occurred during the weeks following the Allied landings in Normandy. As acting commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Meyer oversaw what was arguably the most intense and sustained period of fighting on the Western Front in 1944. The strategic stakes were immense. Holding Caen and the surrounding territory was critical to the German defense of northern France, and for the Allies, breaking through this region was essential to expanding their beachhead and liberating the rest of the country. The combat that followed became emblematic of the ferocity and desperation that characterized the late war engagements of the Waffen-SS. By mid-June, Meyer's division was fully engaged in defensive battles around Caen, facing off primarily against Canadian and British forces. The division, though heavily outnumbered and undersupplied, launched repeated counterattacks in areas such as Bretteville, Buron, and Carpiquet airfield. Meyer's operational methods were aggressive and fluid, relying on quick movement of armored units and local counterstrikes to delay Allied advances. He frequently placed his command posts near the front and made personal reconnaissance tours under fire, a habit that contributed both to his tactical awareness and to his mythos among German troops. One of the most emblematic engagements under Meyer's leadership was the defense of the Carpiquet airfield in late June and early July. Allied forces, particularly the Canadians, launched several determined attacks to seize the strategically important installation west of Caen. Meyer's forces, including elements of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, repelled multiple assaults despite severe artillery bombardments and a constant threat from Allied air power. The terrain offered little natural cover, and the fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters engagements, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In response to mounting pressure, Meyer increasingly resorted to flexible defense-in-depth tactics. Rather than static trench warfare, his units often allowed Allied advances to stretch their lines before launching ambushes or localized counterattacks. He coordinated these actions with limited armored reserves and artillery, making efficient use of what little material the division still possessed. His capacity to hold positions, despite encirclement threats and crumbling supply lines, earned him further commendations from the SS High Command, and reinforced his status as a divisional leader capable of high-stakes improvisation. However, the intensity of the fighting also revealed the limits of even the most capable commanders. The Allied buildup in Normandy was overwhelming in both scale and logistics. American and British forces enjoyed continuous aerial surveillance, uninterrupted supplies, and coordinated support across all branches of service. In contrast, Meyer's division was being steadily depleted. Tanks destroyed by Allied Typhoon fighter bombers could not be replaced. Experienced NCOs lost in action were substituted with hastily trained conscripts. The 12th SS, once a potent striking force, was gradually reduced to scattered defensive clusters operating in isolation. The civilian population around Caen also bore the brunt of the fighting. Urban centers were subjected to devastating Allied bombardments, while German defensive operations turned villages into strongpoints, often resulting in entire communities being leveled. Meyer's division was known to use civilian structures for cover and observation, further complicating the already blurred lines between military and non-combatant targets. Though Allied forces made efforts to avoid civilian casualties, the destruction in places like Caen and Villers-Bocage was near total by the time Meyer's division withdrew. By early August, the German situation in Normandy was rapidly collapsing. Operation Cobra, launched by American forces to the west of Caen, had succeeded in breaking through German lines and initiated the encirclement of significant Wehrmacht and Waffen SS formations. Meyer's remaining units were caught in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket, an operational trap that sought to encircle and destroy retreating German forces between Falaise, Argentan, and Trun. Despite Meyer's attempts to coordinate a breakout and link with neighboring formations, the destruction of the German 7th Army was inevitable. In one of his final combat actions in Normandy, Meyer personally directed a rearguard action intended to hold a corridor open for retreating German units. He reportedly coordinated the last armored thrusts from his command vehicle while under artillery fire, attempting to delay the Allied advance long enough for remnants of his division to escape. The effort was ultimately futile. Allied air superiority and ground coordination closed the pocket, and tens of thousands of German troops were either killed or captured. Meyer narrowly escaped capture during the chaos, retreating eastward in disguise as German command structure across the sector disintegrated. The failure in Normandy marked the end of Meyer's active battlefield command. Although decorated for his leadership, including the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, his military career had reached its zenith. The division he once led had been annihilated, and his name had become inextricably linked with both battlefield prowess and the atrocities that followed in its wake. The events of this phase not only sealed his fate as a future defendant in war crimes proceedings, but also framed his place in the historical memory of the Waffen SS, a symbol of tactical effectiveness overshadowed by the brutality of ideological warfare. In the months that followed, the war moved into its final phases. For Kurt Meyer, however, the war's most consequential battles would no longer be waged on the front lines, but in courtrooms and public debate, where the legacy of his command, the fate of his soldiers, and the nature of justice in the wake of global conflict would all be contested. As the Allied advance progressed beyond Normandy and the German military retreated across Western Europe, the collapse of the Third Reich became inevitable. For Kurt Meyer, this period marked a dramatic descent from frontline command into a fugitive existence. Following the closure of the Falaise Pocket in mid-August 1944, Meyer found himself cut off from the remaining organized SS formations. He shed his uniform, adopted civilian clothing, and attempted to move eastward through France. His flight was emblematic of many high-ranking SS officers who sought to avoid Allied capture and the accountability that would come with it. For several weeks, Meyer traveled under false identity, hiding in barns, moving at night, and relying on sympathetic civilians and local collaborators. Eventually, however, he was recognized and captured by Belgian partisans near the city of Sponten in September 1944. Unlike many captured officers who were swiftly transferred to regular prisoner of war camps, Meyer's fate was more complex. Given his notoriety, his actions in Normandy, and his command of a division implicated in multiple war crimes, Allied authorities designated him a high-priority detainee. Initially interrogated by British forces, Meyer was later handed over to the Canadian military, whose troops had borne the brunt of the 12th SS defenses in Normandy. It was during this phase that investigators began collecting testimonies from Canadian soldiers, survivors, and liberated civilians regarding the conduct of Meyer's division. Evidence mounted that SS troops under his command had executed prisoners of war shortly after their capture, often in violation of the Geneva Conventions and in defiance of established military law. While Meyer awaited trial, he was held at a Canadian-run internment camp in Aurich, Lower Saxony. There, Allied prosecutors prepared one of the most significant cases against a Waffen SS commander to date. The charges were carefully constructed to avoid accusations of victor's justice and to rest on legal principles rather than political vendettas. The focus was not only on individual criminality, but on the responsibilities of leadership in the context of systemic violence. Meyer's rank, visibility, and operational control made him a natural focal point for the prosecution. The trial, which began in December 1945, was closely watched by journalists, historians, and political observers. It was one of the first war crimes proceedings held by a Commonwealth nation, and one of the earliest efforts to apply the emerging doctrine of command responsibility. Throughout the trial, prosecutors emphasized that Meyer had created an atmosphere in which his subordinates believed they were permitted, or even expected, to kill prisoners. The ideological indoctrination of the Hitler-Jugend recruits, the repeated failure to discipline officers involved in unlawful killings, and the inflammatory speeches made to his troops all formed part of the evidentiary foundation. The defense sought to minimize Meyer's culpability by invoking the fog of war. They portrayed the situation in Normandy as chaotic, fluid, and marked by broken communication lines. Meyer's attorneys argued that he could not have known about every incident on the battlefield, nor could he be expected to prevent every breach of protocol under such conditions. They also highlighted the absence of direct written orders, casting doubt on the assertion that Meyer had actively commanded the executions. Despite these arguments, the court rendered a guilty verdict on multiple counts, including incitement to deny, quarter, and responsibility for the unlawful killing of prisoners. The verdict marked a legal turning point. For the first time, a military court recognized that ideological conditioning, patterns of conduct, and the failure to correct violations could amount to criminal liability. Meyer was sentenced to death by firing squad, a decision that was intended not only as punishment, but as precedent. But the sentence did not stand. In January 1946, the Canadian government, after reviewing the case, commuted Meyer's sentence to life imprisonment. Officially, the decision was based on the ambiguities in the evidence and the broader goal of legal consistency. Unofficially, however, political pressures, especially concerns about German public opinion and the need for post-war stability, played a role. With Cold War tensions rising, the Western Allies were increasingly hesitant to inflame anti-occupation sentiment in West Germany. Meyer was transferred to Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick, Canada. His life in prison was austere, but he was allowed to write letters, receive visitors, and continue his involvement with SS veterans associations. Over the next few years, he quietly worked on his memoirs and maintained correspondence with former comrades. Meanwhile, HIAG, the German veterans lobby representing former Waffen SS members, began campaigning for his release. They argued that Meyer had served honorably, had already been punished sufficiently, and was being scapegoated for broader crimes committed by others. Their campaign eventually bore fruit. In 1951, Meyer was repatriated to West Germany and transferred to the military prison in Warl. 2 years later, in 1954, he was released on parole, having served less than a decade of his life sentence. His release marked a shift in post-war attitudes, as former SS officers were increasingly reintegrated into West German society and permitted to participate in public discourse. Meyer, once branded a war criminal, now re-emerged as a voice for veterans' rights and an advocate for a revisionist interpretation of the Waffen SS's legacy. This resurgence was not without backlash. In Canada, veteran organizations and families of murdered soldiers expressed outrage at his release. In West Germany, Meyer's public speeches, often filled with historical justifications and claims of military honor, were criticized by scholars and politicians committed to confronting the legacy of Nazism. Nonetheless, he found a willing audience in certain military and nationalist circles, and his influence within Chayag grew steadily. By the late 1950s, Meyer had become a key figure in the movement to rehabilitate the image of the Waffen SS. He gave speeches, participated in commemorative events, and lobbied for the restoration of military pensions to former SS members. While always avoiding overt Holocaust denial or overt fascist rhetoric, he carefully crafted a narrative in which the Waffen SS were portrayed as misunderstood patriots rather than ideological instruments of a genocidal regime. Meyer's ability to maintain this position without legal repercussion reflected the complex post-war politics of West Germany, a nation navigating between memory, justice, and the pressures of Cold War geopolitics. His public re-emergence symbolized not only the unresolved questions of guilt and responsibility, but also the fragility of historical consensus in a society still grappling with the legacy of total war. Following his release from prison, Kurt Meyer positioned himself at the forefront of West Germany's SS veterans movement, becoming a key figure in the public battle over memory and historical interpretation. No longer a battlefield commander, he assumed a new role, that of ideological guardian for the reputation of the Waffen SS. His activities during this period highlight a broader post-war trend, the strategic rehabilitation of former SS personnel within West German society, and the shifting political calculus that allowed their reintegration. Meyer's personal trajectory mirrored the collective attempts by SS veterans to reframe their wartime actions not as criminal, but as patriotic service distorted by victor's justice. In the mid-1950s, Meyer became one of the most visible representatives of Hayag, Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, the influential lobby group founded by ex-SS officers. Ostensibly an organization for mutual assistance, HIAG quickly developed into a powerful pressure group, advocating for the legal and social rehabilitation of Waffen-SS veterans. Through newsletters, public events, and publications, HIAG pushed a revisionist narrative that the Waffen-SS had been an apolitical elite combat force, distinct from the criminal branches of the Nazi regime. Meyer's role within HIAG was both symbolic and functional. He was often presented as a model soldier, decorated, charismatic, and a victim of Allied injustice. In speeches and articles, he carefully avoided overt Nazi apologism, but repeatedly downplayed or denied the ideological nature of the Waffen-SS. He stressed themes of comradeship, military professionalism, and sacrifice, drawing deliberate comparisons between his units and Allied elite formations. This rhetorical strategy aimed to sever the Waffen-SS from its complicity in war crimes and genocide, while simultaneously calling into question the legitimacy of the Nuremberg verdicts. His 1957 memoir, Grenadier, became the cornerstone of this campaign. Written in a martial tone and laced with nostalgia, the book presented a version of history in which SS soldiers were simply victims of circumstance, brave men trapped in the gears of a global conflict they did not control. While it refrained from denying war crimes outright, the memoir consistently portrayed Meyer's subordinates as honorable fighters, and their actions in Normandy as responses to the brutal necessities of war. The book enjoyed commercial success in West Germany and was widely circulated among veterans' networks. Critics, however, condemned it as a sanitized and misleading account that evaded responsibility and glorified a criminal organization. Meyer's re-emergence as a public figure was facilitated by the broader political environment of post-war West Germany. With the onset of the Cold War, the Western Allies shifted their priorities toward building a stable and anti-communist federal republic. Former Wehrmacht and Waffen, SS officers were seen not only as politically useful, but also as potential contributors to the new Bundeswehr. Although the SS was officially banned from participation, numerous former SS personnel found ways into civil service or advisory roles. HIAG's pressure campaigns for legal equality, pensions, and honors reflected this recalibrated approach to post-war justice. Meyer's appeals to soldiers' honor resonated with segments of the German public still struggling with defeat, occupation, and the destruction of their national identity. For many veterans, the Waffen SS represented a form of military pride untainted, at least in their minds, by the chaos of the Nazi hierarchy. Meyer's speeches, delivered at reunions and commemorative events, played directly into this sentiment. He spoke of fallen comrades, of bravery under fire, and of loyalty to fellow soldiers. Absent were acknowledgments of the racial ideology that had driven SS operations in the East, or the systemic violence inflicted on civilians. Nonetheless, Meyer's activities attracted growing scrutiny, particularly as a younger generation of Germans began to ask difficult questions about their country's past. In the early 1960s, West German historians, journalists, and legal scholars pushed back against HIAG's narratives, producing detailed research on the criminal nature of the SS and the myth of the clean Waffen SS. Public television began airing programs about concentration camps and the Holocaust. Academic studies began to expose the extent of SS involvement in atrocities not only on the Eastern Front, but in the West as well. Meyer's carefully curated image began to erode under this pressure, though he remained defiant in his public positions. Despite growing criticism, Meyer continued to speak at veterans' events until his death. In these speeches, he repeated the refrain that the Waffen SS had been unfairly maligned, that post-war trials were politically motivated, and that his soldiers had behaved with honor and discipline. He never accepted legal or moral responsibility for the actions committed under his command. Instead, he shifted the focus to themes of betrayal, resilience, and victimization, arguing that history had been written by the victors, and that SS veterans were entitled to respect and remembrance. Meyer died on December 23, 1961, in Hagen, West Germany. His funeral was attended by hundreds of former comrades, including many in uniform or bearing insignia of the former Waffen SS. The event was reported in local newspapers as a solemn tribute to a controversial but respected figure. For his supporters, Meyer was a symbol of loyalty and courage. For his critics, he remained a dangerous revisionist, emblematic of Germany's ongoing struggle to reckon with its wartime past. In the years that followed, the debate over Meyer's legacy would persist. His writings, speeches, and the memory he cultivated became part of a broader cultural conflict in West Germany over how to remember the Second World War, not only its victims, but also its perpetrators. As Germany moved toward democratization and historical self-examination, Meyer's name remained a lightning rod in discussions about memory, guilt, and the boundaries of national identity in a post-Nazi society. Kurt Meyer's legacy entered a critical phase after his death, as historians, legal scholars, and public institutions began to systematically dismantle the myths that had surrounded the Waffen SS for over a decade. The turning point in public discourse about Meyer and figures like him came not from isolated revelations, but from a broader cultural and institutional reckoning. As West Germany entered the 1960s and 1970s, a new generation of Germans, no longer shaped by the trauma of wartime service or the moral fog of immediate post-war recovery, demanded transparency and truth. In this climate, the carefully cultivated image of Meyer as a misunderstood patriot began to collapse under the weight of emerging evidence and academic scrutiny. The critical reassessment of Meyer's wartime actions was spearheaded by historians investigating the Waffen SS's operational conduct in both the Eastern and Western fronts. Using declassified Allied intelligence, wartime testimonies, and captured SS documentation, scholars reconstructed the command structures and disciplinary culture of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. They found clear indications that the division, from its inception, had been shaped not as a conventional fighting force, but as an ideologically driven unit whose members were trained to see the enemy, particularly Slavs, Jews, and political commissars, as subhuman. The indoctrination extended beyond individual belief. It was embedded in tactical instruction, unit cohesion strategies, and field operations. Meyer, as one of the division's senior architects, could not be separated from this ideological framework. The Abbé Ardennes executions, which had been the core of Meyer's war crimes conviction, came under renewed investigation. Forensic teams and legal historians revisited the primary source material, locating further testimonies from Canadian veterans and local witnesses. Reports from military police and post-war tribunals, long neglected in public memory, revealed a pattern of deliberate execution methods. Prisoners separated from others, walked to secluded spots, and shot in small groups. Several former SS soldiers later confessed under questioning that their officers had directly implied such actions were permissible, citing Meyer's battlefield speeches and explicit instructions regarding the treatment of captured enemies. These findings were incorporated into educational initiatives, memorial exhibitions, and media productions. Public television documentaries such as Panzer Meyer, The Soldier, and The Verdict brought the full context of his actions to a wider audience. Interviews with survivors, juxtaposed with archival footage and excerpts from Meyer's own memoirs, revealed stark contrasts between the sanitized narrative he promoted and the brutal realities of SS warfare. Particularly damning were his attempts to equate the Waffen SS with regular Wehrmacht units, an argument increasingly debunked as more archival material from the Eastern Front was released to Western scholars after détente with the Soviet Union. Meyer's speeches at HIAG rallies and veterans' congresses were also subjected to renewed analysis. Audio recordings and transcripts that had once circulated discreetly within veteran circles were now studied as cultural artifacts of post-war denial. Scholars found that Meyer had repeatedly employed language of moral relativism and victimhood, portraying the SS as betrayed by Hitler, demonized by the Allies, and misunderstood by history. These tropes were identified as deliberate rhetorical strategies designed to foster solidarity among former SS men and deflect responsibility by emphasizing collective suffering. In response, German and international institutions took firmer stances against SS rehabilitation efforts. The Bundestag publicly condemned HIAG's activities in the early 1980s, and courts began to restrict the public display of SS insignia and regalia at commemorative events. The German military clarified that any association with the Waffen SS, even for those who had only fought on the front lines, would not be grounds for honorary recognition or inclusion in state-sponsored remembrance programs. Kurt Meyer, once eulogized by former comrades as a soldier of honor, was increasingly excluded from official war memorials. Yet, pockets of resistance remained. Certain far-right groups and nationalist publishers in Germany and Austria continued to circulate Meyer's writings and biographies, framing him as a symbol of military excellence oppressed by political correctness. Online forums in the early internet era amplified these narratives, reaching new audiences eager to mythologize the past. However, these revisionist efforts were increasingly marginal, pushed to the fringes of acceptable public discourse. In parallel, Canadian scholars and veterans worked to preserve the memory of the Canadian soldiers who had perished under Meyer's command. Memorials at the sites of the Abbé Ardennes executions were updated with multilingual plaques, and official Canadian war histories were revised to include explicit reference to war crimes committed by SS forces. Canadian schools and military academies incorporated Meyer's trial into their curricula on military ethics, emphasizing the doctrine of command responsibility and the moral obligations of leadership in wartime. By the turn of the 21st century, Meyer's reputation had shifted definitively. No longer viewed in respectable circles as a misunderstood tactician or victim of Allied vengeance, he had come to represent the dark heart of the Waffen SS's militarized ideology, a man who blended operational competence with ideological conviction, and whose legacy was inseparable from the crimes committed in his name. His story became a case study in how personal charisma and battlefield achievements could be weaponized to obscure systemic violence and moral collapse. Meyer's trajectory, from battlefield commander to convicted war criminal, from imprisoned fugitive to post-war activist, remains one of the most complex and contested in the military history of the Second World War. But by the early 2000s, consensus among historians and institutions had solidified. Whatever tactical skills he may have possessed, Kurt Meyer's service was not that of a soldier fighting with honor, but of a commander enforcing a system built on racial hatred, ideological warfare, and ruthless repression. In the years following the collapse of Meyer's posthumous reputation, broader societal and academic efforts turned toward deconstructing the mechanisms that had allowed figures like him to avoid accountability for so long. A major part of this reevaluation focused on the culture of impunity and selective justice that had emerged in West Germany during the early decades of the Cold War. The turning point for many institutions was not simply moral reflection, but the realization that overlooking the crimes of men like Kurt Meyer had distorted the foundations of democratic remembrance and undermined efforts at reconciliation, both domestically and internationally. The delayed reckoning with Meyer's legacy was made possible by a confluence of factors. Newly opened archives, particularly from Eastern Bloc countries after the fall of the Iron Curtain, provided access to detailed German military records, SS communications, and Soviet intelligence assessments. These materials helped paint a fuller picture of the operational reality of SS units under Meyer's command. Investigative teams uncovered orders that, while not directly signed by Meyer, reflected doctrinal principles he helped enforce. No quarter for partisan prisoners, collective punishment for sabotage, and preemptive violence against perceived resistance. Such directives were shown to have blurred the line between military action and war crime, deliberately and with institutional backing. At the same time, a new generation of prosecutors in Germany, many of whom had come of age after 1968, began reinvestigating dormant war crimes cases. These legal professionals, no longer constrained by deference to military hierarchies or Cold War priorities, reopened files that had once been politically untouchable. Although Meyer himself could no longer be tried, several of his surviving subordinates were brought back into legal proceedings during the 1990s and 2000s, particularly in connection with the Normandy executions. While few convictions resulted due to age and lack of direct evidence, the trials themselves reignited public interest in the ethical failures of the Waffen SS leadership and the systemic nature of its crimes. One of the most critical outcomes of this late-stage judicial activism was the final dismantling of the myth of the clean Waffen SS. Public institutions, including the Bundesarchiv and Germany's Federal Agency for Civic Education, BPB, launched coordinated campaigns to expose the role of SS combat divisions in implementing Nazi genocidal policies. Kurt Meyer featured prominently in these efforts, not as a misunderstood officer, but as a textbook example of how operational excellence was weaponized in service of ideological warfare. Educational materials presented Meyer's unit not only as a combat force, but as a vector for terror, indoctrination, and racial violence. As these narratives entered schools, museums, and mainstream media, they reshaped German national consciousness. The Bundeswehr, Germany's modern military, undertook an internal review of how it addressed the Wehrmacht and Waffen SS legacies. Commemorations that had once silently honored fallen SS soldiers were either canceled or reframed with historical context and disclaimers. Meyer's name, once cited as a model of tactical brilliance, was now almost exclusively referenced in the context of leadership failure, criminal responsibility, and the manipulation of historical memory. Internationally, Canada continued to play a pivotal role in challenging historical revisionism. Memorial ceremonies at Normandy increasingly included references to Meyer's crimes and the Canadian soldiers who had perished in his custody. Joint initiatives between Canadian historians and German scholars produced authoritative works that documented the extent of SS brutality in occupied France. One widely read publication, Command Without Conscience, dissected Meyer's military career in meticulous detail, juxtaposing operational records with survivor testimony to expose the ethical collapse of his command environment. The book became required reading in several military academies, both in Canada and Germany. This reassessment extended beyond academic and state institutions. Popular culture also began to reflect a more critical perspective. Dramatizations, documentaries, and novels shifted from romantic portrayals of elite German units to stories that emphasized the consequences of fanaticism, the moral ambiguities of warfare, and the seductive power of ideology. In these narratives, Meyer was no longer the bold commander on a motorcycle rallying his troops, but a man whose charm, discipline, and strategic sense were ultimately in service to a regime built on extermination and conquest. The transformation in how Meyer was remembered also prompted difficult conversations within Germany's veteran community. Some former members of the Waffen SS, now elderly, began speaking publicly, often for the first time, about the indoctrination they had undergone and the crimes they had witnessed. A few expressed remorse, others insisted they had no knowledge of atrocities. Regardless, the act of speaking out helped dismantle the long-held silence that had allowed men like Meyer to dominate the post-war narrative for decades. By the early 21st century, Meyer's image had undergone a complete reversal in the public imagination. No longer was he presented as a complex or ambiguous figure. He had become a cautionary symbol. His name was used not to glorify, but to interrogate. His career served as a case study in military ethics courses, leadership seminars, and Holocaust education programs. His speeches were dissected not for their rhetorical strength, but for their manipulation of truth. His memoir, once praised in veteran circles, was now cited as an example of post-war denialism. The cumulative effect of this reassessment was not merely to condemn a single individual, but to confront the broader culture that had protected him. Meyer's career illuminated the dangers of uncritical hero worship, the risks of separating battlefield conduct from political ideology, and the long-term consequences of allowing myths to flourish unchallenged. His downfall was not the product of a single trial, book, or documentary, but of decades of incremental work by scholars, witnesses, and citizens committed to preserving historical truth over comforting fiction. By the close of the 20th century, the story of Kurt Meyer had become more than a biography. It had evolved into a mirror reflecting the moral struggles of post-war Europe. His journey from battlefield commander to convicted war criminal, from post-war advocate to symbol of historical distortion, charted the arc of a society wrestling with its past. In Germany, Canada, and beyond, Meyer's legacy stood not as a monument to military brilliance, but as a warning of what happens when ideological loyalty is fused with command authority, and when societies delay the difficult work of accountability. The final reckoning with Meyer's legacy was shaped not only by documents and tribunals, but by a generational shift in memory culture, where once veterans associations and Cold War politics had shielded men like Meyer from deep scrutiny, a new ethos of historical transparency emerged in the 1990s and matured in the decades that followed. In this climate, there was no longer space to separate Meyer the soldier from Meyer the ideologue, or to sanitize the Waffen SS's role as merely tactical. Military professionalism, in his case, had served as the mask of ideological extremism, and once the mask was removed, what remained was complicity. Modern historians increasingly point to Meyer as an archetype of the SS officer who blurred the lines between strategy and savagery. He was not an anomaly, nor a monster outside the system, but a product of the very structures the Nazi regime had cultivated. His rapid ascent, his battlefield conduct, and his ideological discipline were all traits rewarded by the Third Reich. And when the war ended, those same qualities, charisma, denial, narrative control, were weaponized again in the struggle for post-war remembrance. For decades, Meyer's voice dominated the conversation around his own history. But eventually, history pushed back. Institutions like the German Bundesarchive, Canadian War Museum, and numerous independent scholars now frame Meyer's life as a pivotal case in the study of military ethics, collective guilt, and the politicization of memory. The 12th SS Panzer Division is remembered not for its tactical resilience, but for its indoctrination, brutality, and the young lives, on both sides, it consumed. Memorial sites in Normandy explicitly name Meyer in connection with the war crimes committed there, and public school curricula reference his trial as a landmark in the legal doctrine of command responsibility. The same figure who once claimed to embody soldierly virtue now embodies the dangers of conflating loyalty with righteousness. In Germany, Meyer's name is largely absent from military honors, war memorials, and official state commemorations. HIAG, the lobby group he once helped lead, dissolved in obscurity, its arguments discredited, its publications withdrawn from mainstream circulation. Veterans who once marched under SS banners now do so in silence, as state institutions have made it clear that no form of fascist nostalgia will be tolerated under the banner of democracy. Even in the digital age, where extremist groups continue to circulate sanitized myths about Meyer and the Waffen SS, their impact is largely counterbalanced by a robust scholarly presence and public awareness. Archives, documentaries, and historical societies maintain accurate records, and online platforms now flag or suppress overt revisionist content. The myth of Meyer as a misunderstood patriot may still echo in certain circles, but it no longer dominates the historical record. In the final measure, the story of Kurt Meyer is not one of redemption, but of exposure. His actions, his words, and the long campaign to rewrite his legacy have been laid bare. What remains is a complex but unflinching understanding of how ordinary men, intelligent, disciplined, even charismatic, can become instruments of state terror when they submit themselves fully to an inhuman ideology, and how, even decades later, the truth, though delayed, can prevail. Meyer's legacy today stands as a permanent entry in the ledger of accountability. Not a hero, not merely a criminal, but a cautionary figure, a case study in the corrosive effect of ideology on duty, and a testament to the enduring power of historical truth over myth.